you came to hear this conversation with Dr. Suzanne Maloney, and so I'm pleased to welcome her. She is the Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Her research focuses on Iran and Persian Gulf energy. At Brookings, she is a leading voice on U.S. policy toward Iran and the broader Middle East, testifying before Congress, briefing policymakers, and engaging with government, nonprofit organizations, and corporations. Dr. Maloney also serves on the External Research Council for the National Intelligence Council and is a frequent commentator in national and international media. She has advised both Democratic and Republican administrations on Iran policy, including as an external advisor to senior State Department officials during the Obama administration and as a member of Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's policy planning staff. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maloney. So I want to start with maybe a tour of the insecurity that we've seen in the Middle East coming up on the second year anniversary of the October 7th attacks in Israel. And a way that I might think about this is as maybe 5 theaters of conflict, at least 5 theaters of conflict that involve Iran. And so if I could, I'd love your input onto how things have gone in those theaters from the Iranian perspective. So we can start with a theater related to Hamas and Gaza.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here. And thanks to all of you who've shown up to engage in this conversation today. I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk with you all. I think it's actually, especially at this time of year, very important that we begin with understanding the Iranian relationship with Hamas and the Iranian role in at least having some foreknowledge of the October 7th attacks and certainly providing the wherewithal in terms of both the training, the funding, the material support to Hamas that enabled those attacks to take place. And since October 7th, really in the aftermath of October 7th, Iran sought to use those attacks to amplify its own position, to strengthen its allies, and its proxies around the region. And for the first year or so, it did so very, very effectively. Now, of course, the Iranian relationship with Hamas is a little bit of an idiosyncratic one. Hamas is a Sunni group. Iran is a Shia power, and those sectarian differences have often made a very had a lot of impact on Iran's regional relationships. Historically, its most important proxies were Shia groups, most notably Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was really the crown jewel of Iran's proxy network of militias around the region. But its relationship with Hamas evolved, particularly after Hamas prevailed in local elections, and the international community and some of the longstanding support that Hamas had relied upon from leading countries in the Arab world began to dry up. And Iran stepped into that breach and became an important, essentially, funder and supporter of Hamas, even at times when they were on different sides of key conflicts, particularly in Syria, where Hamas and Iran were supporting different sides of the conflict. But Iran is incredibly opportunistic in terms of building these relationships. Its leadership has use these proxy networks to extend its influence across the region. And so the investment in Hamas continued even as it ebbed during the Syrian civil war. And Iran was very much involved in championing the attacks on 10/7 and trying to use those attacks to extend its own influence and position across the region. Of course, the war has eradicated much of the Hamas leadership. It has put Hamas in a position of considerable weakness compared to its pre-10/7 posture. The Iranians would like to see Hamas, at least in some form, survive intact. But as we see today, even with the diplomacy in Washington, there appears to be a deal on the table that would require Hamas, those residual Hamas leadership figures, to either accept some kind of amnesty and leave Gaza, or the war would continue. And I think that from the Iranian point of view, it will likely support what I expect to be Hamas' refusal to accept those terms. because the war, in their view, has been in their interest. Now, we're going to talk about other theaters in the war. We're going to talk about what it has meant for some of Iran's other proxies. And I think that, overall, Iran's position today is considerably weaker than it was 2 years ago. And that has come at the hands of Israeli military power across the region, and even, of course, including on Iranian territory. But for the Iranians, that came at essentially a high point. And so while they have been set back considerably, while their proxies have been set back considerably as a result of Israeli military action, they still see this network as essentially their insurance policy across the region, and they still believe and they still look for opportunities to stoke conflict because that is their inroad into Arab capitals. They're not able to sell an economic model that is successful. They're not able to sell a political or a societal model that is particularly successful. And what they've been able to sell is their brute power and their ability to protect and sustain their proxies and allies across the region. And conflict is good for business.
I think that's a really important context to have. And remembering that Iran had was at a pinnacle of power just a few years ago. And now as we go through this list of theaters, Iran has had setbacks, but perhaps still maintains a lot of influence. So let's turn to Hezbollah. So you had already mentioned Hezbollah being a proxy of Iran. How have things gone for Hezbollah?
Well, Hezbollah obviously has been considerably set back as well. I think we've just marked the 1-year anniversary since the death of Hassan Nasrallah, who was in many ways the leader of all of Iran's proxy groups. He had a personal relationship with the Iranian supreme leader that dated back many years. He was really one of the only leading figures in the region who had recognized the Ayatollah Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, as his marjaya taqlid, which is a kind of theological term which suggests a certain degree of obeisance to Khamenei's religious and theological edicts. That was particularly, I think, important. He spoke Persian. They went back many, many years, and his death at the hands of Israeli bunker busting bombs, along with the decapitation of the rest of Hezbollah's leadership, I think is going to be the longest standing setback for Iran across the region. This is really something from which Iran will struggle to recover. And that's why this whole debate about what happens within the Lebanese political sphere, what happens to Hezbollah, is it actually forced to fully disband and disarm, is so critical. If in fact the problem of Hezbollah was ended from a military point of view, the Iranians would have a very grave difficulty in terms of trying to reconstitute some of the other proxy militias that they had funded over the course of many years. Hezbollah was like the trainer of the trainers. It was a group that had consolidated its own position in Lebanon, both politically and militarily, as the strongest power within the country. And it was able to help orchestrate Iran's transnational militia armies that fought in Syria and elsewhere. And so if in fact Hezbollah were to vanish from the scene, which of course has not yet happened, even though it was considerably eroded by the military strikes over the course of the second half of 2024, Iran, I think, would have difficulty in finding an alternative. We'll come to the Houthis, and there are many who look at the Houthis as trying to move into this role that Hezbollah had played, but I think both from a strategic, theological, and even a geopolitical perspective, it's very unlikely that you'd be able to replace the role that Hezbollah played. Now, the challenge, of course, for Hezbollah is that there is, the Lebanese society would prefer not to see this militia group continue. And so there has been, I think, an opportunity that presents itself. But again, as really with the picture of Iran at the pinnacle of its power over the course of 2023 and into early 2024, Hezbollah itself has also seen considerable setbacks and has been able to rebuild. One of the key questions is whether the Iranians can actually resupply the very precise rockets and missiles that they had been able to provide to Hezbollah, as well as the capacity to build those materials. If they are able to resupply, then it's going to be much more difficult to ensure that Hezbollah can bounce back. For now, that resupply seems to be disrupted, and it's going to be quite challenging, of course, depending on what happens in Syria.
Yes, well, so you already started talking about the Houthis, so let's go to Yemen. That relationship between Iran and the Houthis has always been a bit puzzling. What is Iran trying to achieve in Yemen and in the region via the Houthis?
I think the relationship initially began because of the enmity between the Iranians and the Saudis, as well as some of the other Gulf states. This was an opportunistic relationship to some extent for the Iranians, as were others. And they, I think, weren't heavily invested, although they were trying to provide military support to the Houthis as they fought against the Saudis and the coalition during the civil war in Yemen. But what I think that they have found is that the Houthis were exceptionally good students, that they have been able to, as with Hezbollah, provide the means of not just weaponry, but actually building and creating their own arsenal, and that the Houthis have a sort of ambition to play a larger role on the regional stage, and have been reasonably effective at doing so, both in terms of their ability and willingness to disrupt maritime traffic in the Red Sea, but also to target Israel, which was, I think, something that was unimaginable when you talk to Israelis about what has happened since October 7th. That's one of the many dimensions that I think has come as something of a shock, that this kind of what was perceived as a ragtag militia without any, real strategic ambitions was targeting, in some cases, targeting successfully Israeli territory. And that remains, I think, a considerable threat. One of the persistent questions is how much actual influence does the Iranian leadership have over the Houthis? I think that remains to be seen. We know, in fact, it was a close and ongoing consultations over decades between Hassan Nasrallah and Hezbollah and Iran. I don't know that we have that level of granularity in terms of the bilateral relationship such as it exists between the Houthi leadership and the Revolutionary Guard. There have been Revolutionary Guard, or there were Revolutionary Guards stationed in Yemen for many years. And so the training and the relationship exists, but it's not clear to me that it exists at a political level.
Okay, so you're mentioning now the Revolutionary Guard, and you've already mentioned the Syrian civil war. So now let's switch to another theater, which is thinking about Syria. So what has Iran been trying to do in Syria prior to the fall of Assad, and what does its prospects look like now that Assad is out of power?
Well, Syria has always been, I think, a contested territory for Iran. They had a often difficult relationship with Hafez Assad, the father. And I don't know that Bashar Assad was particularly well loved by anyone within the Iranian leadership, but it was a crucial piece of geography for Iran in terms of its proximity to both Hezbollah as well as its proximity to Israel. And for that reason, they have invested heavily, particularly in propping up Bashar Assad during his long civil war with his own people. And during that time, they developed a strategic partnership with Russia. So Syria, despite being often a problematic ally for Iran and a changeable and inconsistent ally over the course of the past 46 years, proved to be particularly important over the course of the past decade, both in terms of building this partnership between Moscow and Tehran, despite some historical bad baggage between them, and also creating the opportunity for Iran to really battle test its ability to pull together proxy forces from across the region and apply them against a common enemy. And that's exactly what happened in Syria. Iran drew on Shia from South Asia in a lot of cases, the Fatemiyun and other brigades who were recruited from Afghanistan and Pakistan, as well as Hezbollah, as well as in some cases Iraqi militias, all contributing to helping to ensure that Bashar Assad could stay in power. That all, of course, collapsed less than a year ago, I think, in almost absolutely stunning display historic providence. And, you know, we were just talking about the fact that over the course of the United Nations General Assembly, the new Syrian president was interviewed by former U.S. commanding general in the Middle East, David Petraeus in New York. And so you have this sort of incredible irony of one of the leading generals who was involved in the campaign in Iraq, interviewing a former jihadist who is now recognized by the United States and part of a potential new alignment of power in the Middle East. I think the loss of Syria is on par in terms of for what it means for Iran with the loss of Hezbollah. And we'll see where those go, where both those go. I indicated that, you know, Hezbollah is down but not out. In Syria, I think we see the prospects of a stable new state, but it is still very, very early days. There is a lot of considerable ethnic violence. The Israelis are playing a very heavy role in trying to ensure that they have a buffer zone and ensure that the jihadists can't mobilize in a way that are going to threaten either them or threaten minority populations in Syria. And that kind of instability and conflict and disruption is exactly the kind of opportunity that Iran might be looking for in terms of redeveloping some influence there, as well as potentially rebuilding its land bridge to resupply Hezbollah in Lebanon.
So I think we'll return to the refrain of down but not out. I think we can think about these setbacks with these theaters on Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, the Syrian civil war, and let's think about down but not out with regard to Iran proper, which is maybe sort of a fifth theater, both with regard to its nuclear program and the June war involving Israeli and American strikes, as well as other dynamics with regard to internal politics. President Raisi having died in a helicopter crash last year. What are we seeing with regard to Iran proper over the last 3 years?
I think there too, I mean, the word of the day, I guess, is significant setbacks. And, you know, it's almost unimaginable over the course of the past 18 months, the beating that Iran has taken, that Iran's national security establishment has taken at the hands of the Israelis. I think one of and the Americans, one of the key questions for me was the decision by the Iranians to escalate and strike Israel for the first time in an attributed way in a volley of drones and missiles, ballistic missiles fired in April of 2024. It was a, you know, incredibly meaningful escalation in the sense that it gave the Israelis a chance to respond directly, but then, of course, set the stage for this more intense campaign that began in the aftermath of the killing of Nasrallah and the attacks in Lebanon, in which the Iranians responded once again directly on Israeli territory. And this time in October of 24, the Israelis hit back in a way that I think created really paved the foundation for the June war. They took out key air defense positions. They were able, both in that attack and in the killing of the Hamas political leader in August of 24, Ismail Haniyeh, at the inauguration of the new president in Iran, only hours after Haniyeh had met with the Iranian supreme leader, to take him out with a missile strike. And that, I think, also presaged incredible penetration by Israeli intelligence of Iranian society, which was on full display with the success, the very early tremendous success that they had in the June war of taking out a number of key commanders within the Iranian military, very, very experienced people, a number of important nuclear scientists, and potentially an attack that was intended to fully decapitate the Iranian government. There was an attack on the building in which the Iran's Supreme National Security Council was meeting. Iran's president, Masoud Pezeshkian, who was just in New York last week for the United Nations General Assembly, was injured in that attack. And had that attack actually succeeded, then we might be looking at a very different set of circumstances. Iran today, its nuclear program has been, bombarded heavily. Its key facilities have been destroyed. But of course, at the same time, it retains what we believe to be enough highly enriched uranium to fuel somewhere in the range of 9 to 10 nuclear weapons that have not yet built the weapons. They don't have that capability to our knowledge. But there are also hundreds of centrifuges, advanced centrifuges that had not been installed and whose whereabouts we're not certain of. There's been an effort over the course of the past few months to try to resume some kind of cooperation between Iran and the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is responsible for ensuring that Iran is living up to its safeguard agreements as a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There was a brief moment where it appeared that at least some cooperation is going to resume. But that, once again, has been curtailed by the Iranians as a result of the decision by 3 European states to invoke the snapback clause of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the 2015 nuclear deal, which has been largely moribund since Trump withdrew American participation from that deal in 2018 during his first term, but has been on some kind of life support. And this has been a hotly debated decision whether to go for snapback over the course of the past 5 or 6 years. And the fact that it has now happened means that the international community has few other tools that it can use to, in the non-military realm, that it can use to try to penalize Iran for its nuclear ambitions. And the Iranians have very little left to lose in terms of pushing forward on their nuclear program and continuing to refuse to cooperate with any kind of monitoring or oversight. So I would say, Iran, once again, down but not out, and the world is in a much riskier position in many respects than we were, at least at a time when there was at least some kind of oversight and inspection and monitoring of Iran's nuclear infrastructure.
Which raises a interesting dilemma. So Iran is down, not out. And then the question is, well, how do the Americans push their advantage, or how might the Europeans, who are concerned about proliferation of nuclear weapons, push the advantage of Iran being weak? So in a recent Foreign Affairs article, which I recommend to everyone, you wrote that a revolutionary regime cannot be permanently subdued by force. And so I think that's the important part of the not out component there, down but not out. Can you unpack that for us? Why might we not want to dunk so much on Iran?
Look, I think one of the challenges is simply that I think the will of the American people is that we are not interested in seeing ourselves dragged into yet another long and costly war in the Middle East. I think that is something that President Trump actually, in some ways, intuited before the mainstream Democratic and Republican Party in Washington had fully appreciated it, even in his first run. It's been a kind of consistent theme for him. So he's not going to, I think, mobilize in a way that even President Biden did in the aftermath of October 7th to pre-position an enormous amount of American firepower in the region, both to protect Israel, but also to warn off countries like Iran. And so, there is no military solution to the Iranian nuclear program, as we've just seen, the incredibly sophisticated and really largely successful operation by the Israelis with a little help from their American friends to take out the most deeply buried facilities within the Iranian nuclear infrastructure is not enough to fully end their nuclear ambitions. In some respects, I think it's likely to fuel those ambitions because the Iranians recognize that their deterrence is now eradicated. They no longer have the threat of Hezbollah on Israel's borders to prevent Israel, restrain Israel from attacking Iran itself. They no longer have a credible air defense. They no longer have the pretense of a strategic partnership with Moscow and Beijing that might actually result in some kind of retaliatory support from those capitals. All they have at this point in time is potentially speeding up the nuclear program. And I think that's one of the unintended consequences. We don't yet know. And this is a regime that has made the calculated decision to move relatively slowly, even though they assembled an industrial scale nuclear program. The purposes could not be for anything other than military application. they never crossed that threshold. And there is no other country in the world that has spent 30 to 35 years investing in its nuclear program. And that's only post-revolutionary. There was some pre-revolutionary investments, and not cross that threshold. So that had to be a deliberate decision on the part of the Iranians. It wasn't a lack of capacity. It wasn't because they didn't have the scientific or technological infrastructure to do this. It was, I think, an inherent prudence at the most senior levels of the Iranian leadership, and a desire on the part of the regime itself to remain somehow part of the international community, even as it engaged in the types of activities that might have made it a pariah. And I think we now have to wonder, particularly at a time when there is change within the leadership. The supreme leader is 86 years old. It was announced during the June war that he had officially named 3 individuals who might succeed him. There was a process for that succession, but it's only happened once before in Iranian history. I think the world is now waiting to see what that succession looks like and who takes his place, but also how the Iranian leadership evolves over time. We know that the Revolutionary Guard are a very important component of the Iranian power structure and decision-making authority within the country, far more important than the military was in the first decades after the revolution itself. This could become a much more Praetorian theocracy over time. We simply don't know. But this is the moment, I think, where we have to try to influence Iran to move toward a better path. And at least in the short term, we're not going to have a lot of direct diplomatic opportunity to do so.
That's good. I want to underscore something that you were saying there. I teach a class on nuclear weapons, and a few years ago, we hosted a member of of the intelligence community. And she was saying that, and she was on the Iranian desk, and she was saying that the most important question that they were trying to figure out is what were the political reasons for Iran not to have developed a nuclear weapon by now, because that can help us understand the levers by which you might continue to influence Iranian policy. So I want to underscore that piece. Let me pull the lens back a little bit and thinking about some of the regional dynamics. And so we've talked about a lot of the setbacks that Iran has had with regard to its security in recent years. But one of the things we haven't mentioned is its relationship with Saudi Arabia. If we were having this conversation maybe 3 to 5 years ago, we might be talking more about Saudi-Iran centric discussion. And it seems like they've had a little bit of a détente. And that might also be tied into broader dynamics with regard to Iran's relationships with China and with Russia. So help us pull that lens back. Is that good news that Iran is playing in a different regional environment than it was a few years ago with regard to the Gulf states as well as with Russia and China?
I think it's good news, but it depends for who.
Okay.
And in that respect, I think the good news here is that the rapprochement between Riyadh and Tehran came about in large part due to the change of posture of the Saudi government. When MBS, the Crown Prince, came onto the scene and became de facto the most important decision maker within Saudi Arabia, he had a fairly strenuous ideological, but also competitive view toward Iran. And, he and his father, who had encouraged former US presidents to cut the head off the snake and go after the Iranian theocracy, I think in part because for MBS, it was in part about Yemen, wanted to see some kind of explicit defeat of the Islamic Republic. They opposed the Iran nuclear deal. They opposed any kind of creeping economic or even diplomatic rapprochement with Iran. And I think what has happened over time has been the sobriety of their security situation became very clear, especially during the first Trump administration, when Saudi Arabia was attacked from Yemen and from Iranian territory. Its critical oil facilities were hit very hard. This was something absolutely unprecedented. And there was no response from the United States other than, some formal statements. I wouldn't have believed that, having watched the role that the United States played during the Iran-Iraq war, in which the US was very much involved in trying to protect the security of supply of oil from the Gulf, and also trying to reinforce its allies in the region. And in this point in time, the Trump administration did not respond. And what you saw in the aftermath of that was, I think, a Saudi Arabia that was looking to take greater responsibility for its own security. It built up a relationship, defense, security cooperation with its neighbors, but also including with Israel, despite the fact that it had not and has not yet joined the Abraham Accords and has not yet recognized Israel. There is a very rich and robust defense cooperation between the two countries. That was, I think, just a kind of maturity and realization that they were going to have to be responsible for their own defense with a lot of help and support from the United States, but not relying on the US security umbrella. I think that also persuaded them that, you know, the likelihood of simply eliminating Iran, cutting off the head of the snake, was not going to solve the problem for them. The Iranians had largely been willing to do business with Saudi Arabia, even as they invade against its government. In the last will and testament of Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the founder of the state, died in 1989. He wrote, "You can normalize with America, you can restore relations with Israel, you shall never restore relations with Saudi Arabia." So at one time, it had been a very ideological opposition from within Iran, but there too, over time, a more pragmatic approach had evolved toward their Gulf neighbors. And so I think it is, yes, it's healthier that there is direct diplomacy between these two countries. I think it's a more realistic option than trying to presume that somehow one or the other is going to fade from the earth. But I'm not sure that there's a very high degree of trust. And I'm not sure that it actually resolves any of the security dilemmas.
Thank you for that. I've got a few more questions that I'm going to be asking Dr. Maloney. And so this is a good time for you, the audience, to start preparing some questions. We'll have some time for Q&A. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask about the US. And so how would you characterize the highs and the lows of the US approach over the last few years towards Iran?
Well, we've had a very consistent approach to Iran. It was set in the days after the seizure of the U.S. embassy in November of 1979. Up until that point, the revolution had happened in February. The provisional government had been put in place, an Islamic Republic had been declared, and there still were diplomatic relations. And it was only the seizure of the embassy and the holding of more than 50 people over the course of 444 days that ruptured the relationship. In fact, the U.S. maintained diplomatic relations with Iran until April of the next year, when there was a failed rescue mission. And only at that point did we actually break diplomatic relations with Iran. And we have not had formal diplomatic relations with Iran since that time, which makes diplomacy particularly interesting and challenging. But in the days after the embassy was seized, President Carter commissioned a small task force within the National Security Council to try to develop options to deal with the crisis. And that task force came back to him and said, we need to pursue two lines of effort. One needs to be applying pressure to Iran, economic pressure, military pressure, diplomatic pressure, and the other needs to be trying to use persuasion to get Iran to adopt a more constructive posture. And that's been the approach of every American president, every American administration, Republican and Democratic, since 1979. We've called it different things. It was called carrots and sticks for a while, and then we decided that was pejorative and we shouldn't use that. But really, we've sought to use military pressure, including direct military engagement over the course of the Iran-Iraq War, where America was fighting with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy in the Gulf and was protecting ships of our allies. And providing military and intelligence support to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We've used economic pressure really since those very first days, applying, seizing, at that time, freezing Iranian central bank assets that were outside the country, but then erecting one of the most complex and at some points in time successful economic sanctions programs that we've applied to any state in the world. Innovating in many respects, moving from trade sanctions to using the power of the American financial system to exclude Iran and to force other countries to go along with our sanctions, which is currently the case. We have used diplomatic pressure in all sorts of different ways, trying to isolate Iran in international forums, Also, as you may have seen in the news over the course of the most recent UN General Assembly meetings, the Iranians were prevented from shopping at Costco. And they were forced to a less nice hotel than they normally stay at, which complicated some of their outreach while they were there. So we've used all those forms of pressure, but every single American administration has also sought to engage in negotiations and dialogue with Iran, has reached out in all kinds of different ways, whether it was Reagan or Bush or Clinton. You know, this has been a consistent story that American presidents have often sought to engage in dialogue with Iran. We have rarely been successful in either establishing that dialogue or actually using that dialogue to get anywhere to manage some of the challenges we have with Iran. There are two cases of diplomatic success. One is the negotiations that led up to the Algiers Accord in 1981 that freed the American hostages and then returned some of Iran's frozen assets to it. But then, of course, in 2015, what had been really about 9 years of attempted negotiations with Iran over its nuclear program, beginning in 2006 with the Bush administration and culminating in Obama's second term, an agreement between the United States, 5 other world powers, and the UN and Iran, that Iran would agree to the most comprehensive set of restrictions and verification measures that had ever been enacted on any country that was perceived to be trying to acquire nuclear weapons. It was not a perfect deal. It had, there were a lot of elements that one could critique about it, including the fact that it didn't deal with the past military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program, the fact that it didn't include any provisions that addressed Iran's massive missile capability, that it was proliferating across the region, and that it, of course, didn't address Iran's support for its proxies around the region, which, as we know, were a serious threat to its neighbors. But it was a deal that was viable, that would have given us considerable time to find other ways to persuade Iran that nuclear weapons were not in its interests, that would have given Iran some incentives to cooperate, including greater engagement with Western economies and trade, and could have put the two countries on a different path. Wasn't inevitable. It probably would have fallen apart if we hadn't walked away from the deal, and it's almost certain that the Iranian regime would have in some way not lived up to its end of the bargain. We didn't get the chance to prove that because we walked away first. And I think the challenge that we have now is that it's been even more difficult to engage in any kind of productive diplomacy with Iran because of that example. In 2015, the Iranian Supreme Leader said, we negotiated with America because of the sanctions. We needed to get the sanctions lifted. What he's saying today is that there's no point negotiating with America. They lie to us. They will negotiate with you, and then they'll bomb you the next night. And I think it's going to be exceptionally difficult to get back to any kind of constructive negotiations and to get back to a point where we have that level of visibility into all aspects of Iran's nuclear program.
So one final question then, before opening it up to the audience. So was the failure of the U.S. to uphold its obligations under the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was that a failure of, say, the foreign policy establishment, or is that a failure of polarization, or it's a consequence, manifestation of polarization within the U.S.? Struck me that if I was asking people in 2016 what they thought about the Iran nuclear deal, that could be a pretty clear barometer about how they were going to vote in the 2016 election. And so can you say a little bit more about how we think about foreign policy towards a country like Iran in a polarized environment, and what does that look, what does it mean for U.S. policy going forward?
That's a phenomenal question, and I have to think more carefully to give a good answer. But I think you're right that the polarization around this issue was notable and perhaps distinct from any foreign policy issue that I had experienced. I happen to, am in a Washington household, so I have a spouse who is actually on the other side of the issue. And over the course of the deal, we both were offered by different interest groups to be flown out to Vienna to stand on the sidelines of the hotel where the negotiations were taking place, to give commentary, to feed the media beast around this issue. Neither one of us went. So, but I'm not aware of any foreign policy issue that has ever been such a blood sport, that has ever been, sort of participatory in that fashion. I know that the climate negotiations often bring NGOs and other parties to the sidelines to engage, but I'm not aware of any other arms control negotiations where there were literally cheering squads on both sides, trying to hype the political context for the participating countries in the way that there were around this. And I think that that in some ways was a harbinger of the extent to which the Iran nuclear issue was becoming a litmus test for a politics that was somewhat zero sum. And so you were either with us or you were against us. And so honestly, as someone who was pro-deal, but criticized it, it was often kind of a weird and lonely place to be, because unless you accepted the gospel that the deal was going to fix everything, that the deal was genius and the deal was perfect as it had been negotiated, you were kind of off the reservation. So I think that polarization contributed, it was a feature of the polarization that was infecting the country more broadly. I think that's what's most regrettable about this is that, the decision to walk away from the deal in 2018 was not taken because with a clear-headed weighing of the potential consequences, with a pathway toward building to a better deal. In fact, in the months before President Trump announced that he would walk away from the deal, there had been a lot of pressure mounting. The three European parties who had been negotiating with Iran in the first place, they were negotiating at the first revelation of Iran's undeclared nuclear facilities without US support originally at that time, suddenly, saw the light and were prepared to put more pressure on Iran. We're prepared to go back to the bargaining table and to try to get some stiffer terms from Iran on missiles, on the prior military dimensions. They literally had agreed on some new measures that they would try to impose on Iran. And the French president, Macron, came to Washington and spoke to President Trump about it and said, we're making some progress, isn't this wonderful? And he referenced the name of the lead player from President Trump's administration. President Trump apparently had not heard of the individual, and nothing ever came of it. And so we could have been in this, we could have used the antipathy on the Republican side toward the JCPOA as a lever to get tougher terms in a follow-up deal. We didn't do that. We walked away, and in some respects, what has happened since then was almost foreordained, that Iran would escalate as a means of trying to increase its own leverage, that we would respond, that this would result in a set of military actions, which would be very costly for the region, and that in some respects, we might find ourselves with less capacity to restrain Iran than we had before the deal, and no real pathway to get back to that single approach.
Thank you for that. I thought amazing answer there. We're going to turn it now to some questions from you, the audience, and our helpful members of the AGS Council will be passing around the mic. As you get the mic, please do what I didn't do, which is to introduce yourself. So I realized that I didn't introduce myself. I'm Kyle Beardsley. I'm a professor of political science. Some of you I know, some of you I don't. So great to know you. Please introduce yourself and ask your question briefly, please.
Hi, my name is Noah Hamid. I'm a sophomore here studying economics and political science. Thank you so much for coming. I really enjoyed the talk. Looking ahead to 2030, 2040, as U.S. attention shifts towards Asia and growing criticism of the U.S.-Israel relationship increases, what enduring factors justify keeping Iran at the center of U.S. Middle East policy? And should we view U.S. competition with Iran and with China as distinct challenges or as part of the same strategic framework?
That's a great question. I'll take the second half first and say I do think they're distinct. I don't think they're one and the same. I think Iran plays a small role in the overall, sort of international posture of Beijing. And as we saw in June, it's not a place where the Chinese are prepared to invest significant strategic capital. So I don't think it is part of the China challenge. I think that, for the foreseeable future, Iran is the most disruptive actor in the Middle East. And I realize that that's a statement that some people will contest. But it has been the country that over the course of the state that over the course of the past 46 years has been able to wreak havoc far outside its borders and have destructive influence outside of its borders. Now, that is, something that, as we say, has been set back but hasn't gone away. I don't know that Iran will remain the, focal point of U.S. policy in the region, but so long as Iran retains the capacity to rebuild and reconstitute its nuclear program, I think that it will have to be a very important strategic priority for Washington.
Hi, I'm Catherine Shaw. I'm a sophomore here studying public policy and Asian Middle Eastern studies. As someone with a lot of Iranian family who continues to say, oh, when will these people have enough? Like Khomeini will fall and they're gonna, take over. Do you think we'll see a regime change in Iran anytime soon? And if so, what kind of place, like Israel or the National Guard or the Iranian citizens themselves will play in that?
I would love to see some kind of positive political change within Iran. I was, just happened to time my own studies at the one moment in history where the two governments actually cooperated. And so I was able to study in Iran for about 6 months and visit a few times after that. And it is just, it's been a very long time, but it is an incredible place. And I think I came away from those experiences and from, all my continuing contact with Iranians with the conviction that, when the circumstances present themselves, this is a citizenry which is genuinely prepared for to manage a democratic state in a way that I think is probably not true in many other parts of the region, simply because they understand what sort of popular revolution went wrong, and they will, I think, be careful to avoid that again. Obviously, the Iranian population is now mostly born, almost entirely born since the revolution. But incredibly well educated, incredibly sophisticated. They have thought and debated about, how to have politics and society in a way that I think is fairly unusual. This is the level of development, although there's been considerable setbacks as a result of the sanctions, it is a kind of middle-class society in many respects. So I think the challenge is that there's no alternative opportunity to mobilize. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of political engagement. It is not a totalitarian state in the sense that people voice their opinion. I was told, don't talk, don't ask people politics. Say, oh, I want to talk politics. Say, oh, everyone has a view, and it's it's a very open society in many respects, except it's not a government that respects that open society. And the government has control in a way that, if you asked me 25 years ago when I first came back from Iran, I would have said it's going to change tomorrow. And what we've seen is these repeated attempts by Iranians to go to the streets, whether it's over political issues, social issues, economic issues. They have been forcibly repressed every time. The government, not just through the security forces, but also through the judiciary, is very, very skilled at managing to undercut any kind of movement or opposition mobilization. The only thing that gives me hope is that we don't know what we don't know about Iran. We've always been surprised by what happens within Iran. And so, I think that anything is possible, and that possibility comes at, a time of change. If and as we see some kind of change in the in the supreme leader, I think that creates an opening for at least some kind of different trajectory in the future.
Hi, my name is Celia Lawler. I'm studying international relations, computer science, and Russian. I'm going to ask, I guess, the million-dollar difficult question here. So we've talked about how diplomatic efforts are not going on and economic efforts don't seem to work, and the U.S. American people don't want military action. So if we've talked about all the failures of past administrations and how that's all not working, and we're talking about how Iran has this current negative momentum, I guess, down but not out. So how do we move forward? What's the steps that we take if all the past actions haven't worked? If we're trying to capitalize on this possible regime change in the future or this negative momentum, what do we do now?
I think the opportunity that presents itself now is to try to work with the Europeans around a pathway back from snapback. They had to do this, they've been sort of, this question of when and how do we use this? This is mechanism that was built into the Iran nuclear deal that essentially was supposed to be the fail-safe if and as the Iranians themselves cheated. We didn't really anticipate that we would have a president who would walk away from the deal and that the Iranians would then become non-compliant. And so it was use it or lose it. They had to essentially deploy now. But I think it does at least create a platform for some kind of diplomacy, because the Europeans didn't want to have to do this. What they really wanted was for the Iranians to agree to bring back the IAEA in a fulsome way to ensure that there were meaningful inspections, not just here and there, not just when the Iranians agreed to let them come, but essentially what they are obligated to do under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And that's what has been lost in all of this. And it's a multi-decade story now, but the Iranians broke what they had agreed to do. They had agreed as a signatory of the NPT to declare nuclear facilities, to be transparent in their nuclear activities, to not engage in military applications of their nuclear program. And they were clearly doing all these things. And so that's where the standoff began more than 20 years ago. And we have spent 20 years trying to negotiate a solution to it. And we had one that was in place for about 2 years only. I think we can eventually get back there. I don't know that it will happen, without significant political change within Iran, because they are fairly well dug in, and the supreme leader does not appear inclined to talk. But he's been there before, and that has changed, that has evolved. So I think we have to be persistent. We have to work in lockstep with our allies. We have to try to rebuild what was the kind of incredible coalition of the P5, the unanimity on this issue that persisted even during the first US-Russia conflict over Ukraine. That was ongoing during the negotiations. And so there was a degenerating relationship between Moscow and Washington during that period. But everyone agreed that they didn't want to see Iran move closer to nuclear weapons capability. And I think if we could get back to that kind of a posture, it will take time, but it can be effective.
Jake Shaw, I'm a student down at NDU at the National Defense University at Fort Bragg. I guess my question is a little more nuanced. The current water crisis, and you might have to give a little background on that. How would you see the U.S., if there are vulnerabilities, either exploiting that to, curb Iranian behavior, or potentially assisting to, show support and maybe regain that diplomatic relationship?
Iran is suffering from, just incredible drought and mismanagement of its own natural resources, which is culminating in, a genuine sort of economic and also living crisis for Iranians. I mean, it's incredibly dire at this point in time. There have been groups that have sought to build some kind of direct engagement between the US and Iran on issues like this, or whether it's disaster relief, earthquake assistance. I think that there's scope to create those kinds of technical engagements, but frankly, I don't see it happening very quickly. And this, we're currently in a situation where Washington has begun to scale down its support even for its closest allies over natural resources and natural disasters. So it seems a bit implausible to me that this is going to be the avenue for a change in the relationship, but it hopefully is a wake-up call for the regime, because in many respects, this has been a highly developmental system, even though it's predatory and repressive. The Islamic Republic built schools and infrastructure around the country and really helped to pull Iran up to full literacy. And there are some positive developmental outcomes that have come from this regime, but particularly over the course of the past 20 years or so, the level of corruption and mismanagement has just been horrific. And we see these kind of negative externalities in the way that Iran's, inherent resources are being managed. And, it is going to contribute to their own political vulnerability over time. I'm just not sure that it's much of an avenue for Washington right now.
Let's go ahead and take one more question, if that's okay.
Hi, thank you so much for talking to us. My name's Allie. I'm a senior studying political science and international comparative studies, which is kind of a mouthful. But my question is about the the opportunities for genuine political engagement with the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is kind of bigger than one person in the sense, and we saw a lot during the war this summer, how Khamenei was kind of sidelined by a lot of the IRGC commanders. And I'm wondering if there are politicians, either in parliament or other aspects of the Iranian regime, where negotiation and genuine engagement would be possible with the US.
It's a complex and interesting regime in many respects, and there are iconoclastic figures, even on the more hardline side, who will often be very critical of the system. Ultimately, it's not clear to me that dealing with the outliers is really an avenue to changing policy. There have been these efforts over time to create parliamentary exchanges. I was at a reception 25 years ago, where they snuck the head of the Iranian parliament, the speaker of the parliament, into the Metropolitan Museum, where he happened to bump into several congressmen. That speaker, the then speaker of the Iranian parliament, has been under house arrest now for about 14 years. So it just goes to show you that, even the iconoclasts eventually come up against the system. So I think all dialogue is good. I think engagement is useful, but I think, ultimately what we found with Iran is, both from our own negative experiences during Iran-Contra, as well as these, sort of waylaid efforts to do things in a track two mechanism, that ultimately we need official state-to-state talks. And for the most part, Washington has been willing to do that. Every American president, as I said, has tried to negotiate with Iran. Trump has been, forward-leading since his first term. He would love to talk to the Iranians. The Iranians within the system, because of their own, sort of ideology, have often withheld their willingness to talk directly to the Americans, including throughout the Biden administration. The poor negotiators during the Biden administration never got to meet directly with their Iranian counterparts. They had Europeans, or a few small episodic exceptions to this, but for the most part, the Iranians said, no, we will not meet with you. So they had to have third parties go between them. And the Europeans essentially shuttling between hotel rooms to pass messages like it's, third grade or something. So, I just, in this day and age, and given the depth and longevity of this crisis, it's sort of absurd that we have to resort to those kinds of tactics. And especially when you have a president as unconventional as this one, I would think that there's a lot of opportunity for creative diplomacy.
Well, thank you. If dialogue with Iran is good, dialogue with you has been an absolute treat. Thank you for sharing your insight with us, your expertise. Thank you for your leadership in this space. And please join me in thanking Dr.